Hey guys, what is going on? It's Nathan and Dr. Michelle Fynan, and we are having a conversation today about two really interesting topics and how they kind of mesh together. So, we are diving into a conversation about codependency and loneliness. So, this is going to be really interesting. Michelle was talking to me, and she's like, "Hey, have you ever thought about how these two things are related? I think we should talk about this." And so I said, okay, let's make it happen. You can jump in live. You might be listening over on the podcast, or you might be seeing us on YouTube. Wherever you're at, give us a thumbs up, give us a subscribe, whatever you need to do to show us some love, go and do that. So, Michelle, what's going on in your world today, and what have you been learning about this topic?
Yeah, so codependency comes up a lot in my sessions with couples and even singles too, who are, trying to put themselves out there and addressing what's bubbling to the surface, maybe as they're starting to date, or even just after having been in relationships or even marriages for a number of years. Things are like bubbling up, and I'm seeing a lot of conversation about codependency happening in my sessions. And when people are coming to me for things, I tend to just nosedive deep into everything that I can about, like, well, what is codependency? How can it show up and be present in your life, even as someone who's not in a relationship? And what do we do with it? How do we shift that? So I am reading now the book Codependent No More, and it's been really pretty eye-opening for me, because I can even see how on this continuum I understand codependency, because that was like my lived experience. And at times I swing more into that direction than I do of the island mode, as we've talked about before with like attachment styles. So it's just been something that I found interesting. I'm wanting to learn so much more and have more conversation around it. So that's kind of why I was like, so tell me, loneliness and codependency. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so what am I thinking? First off, I'm the person on the island.
Yeah.
I'm like Tom Hanks, and
You and Wilson.
yeah, give me a volleyball and I'm good to go. But when you were talking about it and you first brought up the topic, I was thinking, yeah, I see this all the time. I don't think that I was necessarily like aware of it, right? We were talking about before we hopped on, how you're like, this book is making things like common sense, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's how this showed up in my real life. And I think that when I think about how loneliness and codependency are attached, it's the common response that I get to solving what people think is the problem of loneliness. And that's, oh yeah, Nathan, just I'll get in a relationship, everything will be great.
Boom.
The problem will be solved. And what is that really? That's looking for an external solution where
Mm-hmm.
you are dependent on that other person to solve the problem. So there's
Mm-hmm.
definitely a huge correlation, in my opinion, to the two states of being. And before I was like looking up definitions, right? And I was looking at some of the leading research, and with loneliness, what happens is most people relate it to being the guy on the island. And in reality, that's more of the definition of isolation.
Right.
But we tie them both together. And I think what speaks to me most, and anybody who's been a part of my community for a long time, is when you look at the definition of loneliness, it's a perceived feeling of isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, people say, well, is being alone and being lonely the same thing? No, and I think that's what these two definitions are speaking to. But they have a perception that, again, going back to the codependency, I need this person to be in my life. If they're not in my life, then I'm not complete, or I don't have everything that I need.
Right. And then I think what I'm also seeing then is what happens when that person or just someone is in your life and the feeling of loneliness remains. So, and I think that's, or maybe it doesn't remain from the beginning, but it creeps back in. And it's this idea of, I thought I had fixed the problem. You know, I thought that I avoided having to feel that way by, you know, being in a relationship, or, oh, well, I'm in a relationship and I still kind of feel that way. I must need to get married. Oh,
Ooh.
well, now I'm in this marriage and I thought that was going to change the feeling, and I'm still feeling um, alone. And I think you differentiating loneliness and like isolation is important, because I think we can be in a room full of people or in a committed relationship or dating multiple people and still feel very lonely. And that happens when we have a dependency on others to tell us how we're supposed to feel. And not like literally tell us,
Yeah.
but it's something that we feel, or we're giving away that power.
And oh man, yeah. So an interesting thing there, having people tell us how we're supposed to feel. Um it just leads to so much, because that person isn't in your circumstance. And I think that it's one of the problems that we run into as human beings is we start using language that perpetuates a problem. So even you could say that for some of the things that I say. Sometimes when I say them, people probably aren't ready to hear them, and they're like, well, that's easier said than done. Like, okay, make that call.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You may not be ready to make the call. 100% honest. You might hear me say that and be like, well, Nathan, that's easy for you to say. You talk about this all the time. You have all this experience around that. And then it's like, um, one that I'm thinking of right now is when somebody says, just calm down.
Oh, yeah. Mm.
Right? And there's a whole list. So I would love to hear from people as you are listening to this or seeing us talk about this. What are some of those things that you hear people say and you're like, yep, that doesn't work. It actually makes things worse. So yeah, calm down. That's a huge one. Or even I saw a thing that was a meme with a little kid and his mom, and then underneath it, it was the grown up man that the kid became. And she's like, don't cry. I'll give you something to cry about.
Yep.
And then when the kid grew up, the question was, well, why aren't you showing any little bit of emotion?
Mm-hmm.
because I was told that was not what I was supposed to do. And I think that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and it does begin at an early age for some, where there's this conditioning of what you're feeling should not be felt, again, with the should word, and you're wrong for feeling that way. So then there's a level of growing up not trusting yourself or not believing that your feelings are valid. And that can certainly start the codependent ball rolling. But what I really learned too about the history of the word codependency, it really began with describing the person who is who is in a relationship with someone who has addiction to substances. So that person is the one with the addiction, and then the one who loves them is the codependent. Okay, so they're both dependent on something here. And what ends up happening is a series of, like, the events that occur in relationship with someone who is in active addiction, it shapes behavior of those around them. So you see a lot of, making excuses for them, or, feeling like the partner is responsible for them not kicking this addiction. Like, oh, if they loved me, they wouldn't be using, right? So it kind of started in that realm. But I'm learning through this book that it also shows up in relationships where maybe it's not like I'm with someone who's an alcoholic, but maybe I'm with someone who has alcoholism in their family, and those behavior traits were passed down because we pass down what we know, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and also another one, since you and I talk a lot about physical disability, when chronic illness and there's a level of dependency along with disability, when that is present in a relationship, that's where you can also see codependent behaviors popping up. So either the parent of the child with the disability, they become codependent on one another instead of really pushing forward with independence. And we see that quite a bit. Now that I'm looking at it through that lens, I'm like, oh, that's what's happening. We talked about boundaries, we talk about independence, but codependency fits in there as well.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is I'm just thinking about there's an identity there. And so in any of these relationships, whether it's the disability, whether it's the active addiction, there is a identity that says this is the person that I am. And also, I think one of the things I was thinking is I don't know so much about the disability. It probably is, but definitely in addiction, I imagine that people are like, how could this be my family member? Or what did I do to create this situation? And in reality, you may not have done anything, but you took on that responsibility. And that's what's creating the codependency, because you feel like it's your problem to solve and you can't solve it.
Yes. Okay. So the your problem to solve part is like a big part of the codependency. When you said the whole, like, don't feel that way, like telling somebody to calm down, we're essentially saying don't feel that way. We're taking on the responsibility of their feeling, right? So, but also on the flip side, it's like that person who's being told that is giving away the responsibility of their feeling, really. So it's this interesting dynamic that ends up occurring.
Well, and it's interesting that you would say the part about giving away, because I think if you accept the idea that when somebody says don't feel that way, if you accept what they're telling you as true, you don't have any like responsibility to the feeling. What happened is it became that other person's feeling. And like, really, when we say that, we're invalidating
Mm-hmm.
the person who's actually experiencing it. And all this is interesting because what it brings to me is when we're in that cycle, because there's probably times when each of us have been in a cycle like this. um, it's usually our own feeling of insecurity or uncomfortableness with the situation that just makes us want to like, we're like, okay, let's
Let me
get
fix
this,
this.
let's get it out of the way as soon as possible. I don't want to feel this anymore, even when
Exactly.
it's not you experience. Like, you're just taking on the experience and not realizing you don't have to do that.
100%. And, I could just to give everyone an example, if they're kind of like, this is like an interesting topic, but I'm not really connecting the dots here. Like, as a parent, I can see how codependency can really begin. You think that you're doing something to help your child, when in reality, you may be um, making them feel like they can't do it on their own. And they're going to believe you because you're the adult. And I think that that's where we see it, not just in the disability community, but just even with parents who maybe learned some codependent behaviors themselves along the way, and they're thinking they're doing a great thing. And, they don't really make you go to parenting classes when you have these children. So we're all just kind of doing the best we can. But for example, like, my little ones will do whatever they can do, and rightly so, because they're trying to get what they want. And that makes sense. That's where my boundaries need to be more solid. But they'll be like, Mommy, they'll pull at the heartstrings. Mommy, I can't sleep without you. I'm like, oh, you can't. Like, and then there's that voice that's like, there's only going to be a few more years until they're not going to want me there. I'm okay, fine. Like, I'll be here. It'll help you get to sleep. I'll feel great. Cut to 7 years later, and they're like, no, Mommy, I still need you to go to sleep. I've developed this, this behavior of you need me, when in reality they don't need me. So it's an interesting dynamic of seeing, well, now we've got to start setting some boundaries so that they know they could go to sleep without me. And I need to be able to ensure that they feel comfortable doing that, because if not, you're creating like an insecurity with them, you know?
So let me ask you this: with that being the scenario, what's the conversation like between you and your husband? Because your husband's probably like on the opposite end, I imagine,
Yeah.
of this. So what's that like? The conversation with you guys, and how's he probably, I imagine, supporting you and being like, okay, it's time to.
Yeah. This is like a really good, I mean, I am completely happy to be vulnerable and open about this, because I know, one, I'm not the only one. And two, I think it's important to normalize the fact that you can be in a helping profession and you can be great at helping other people and not be blind to your own little downfalls. We won't call them downfalls, but you can struggle in your own personal life, and that's part of being a human. And so our conversations in the past were kind of like, Michelle, like, no, like we can't, this bedtime routine, then they're coming in our bed, like this can't be, this is not going to continue. This just can't go on because nobody sleeps. Nobody is sleeping in that type of scenario. There's feet in your eye. There's, punches to the ribs. It's not. And some people can go a long time without good sleep. I'm one of them. But then when I hit a wall, I'm like, something's got to give. So, his conversations with me were like, okay, here's the goal. Like, what are we going to do? And I had to be in a space where I was ready to receive that. And luckily, he caught me on a day when I was ready to receive it. Probably once I had already hit the wall and I was like, you're right, this is not working, But then it was like, okay, for me, I'm not on that extreme where we can just go cold turkey, where I'm like, sorry, cry it out. Like, you know me, like I would be the one crying it out. So we talked and we came up with a plan of like slowly making this a boundary setting thing that everybody can feel comfortable with. And it feels better all around being that.
It's so interesting because it's starting with codependency and loneliness, and yet I think if you go back and you listen to most of our conversations, they end in, well, the first thing you got to do is you got to get clear on what your boundaries are. Because, as I was listening to the story, it was like, yeah, all the feet in the face, the punches in the
Sounds
eye.
terrible, right?
So in terms of relationships, codependency in one relationship was impacting multiple relationships, because those feet in the eye, those punches in the face, they were impacting your relationship with your husband.
100%. Because my inability to set a boundary with them was then causing him to have to deal with it too. And then he's also, hearing them cry. He's hearing me complain. He's getting the feet in the face. And, so it does affect everyone. And it's just interesting how this thing that you think is rescuing, you think is being supportive, it's really stopping. It's like it's getting in the way of them being able to flourish. So here I am thinking I'm being a good mom by doing X, when really I'm taking on responsibility for their ability to fall asleep. That needs to be something that they are able to do.
Yeah.
On their own.
Yeah. 100%.
With the help of a couple Mr. Nathan books on YouTube, because that's part of the routine for sure.
No, don't do that. Remember, you said they get all hyped up.
They do get hyped by those books. So we started doing those earlier, it's just a shift.
Yeah. So let's kind of bring it back to the idea of loneliness a little bit. And so if we agree that loneliness is a perception, it's a perception of isolation, then the question then becomes, like, what is creating that belief within me? And one of the greatest things that I've ever seen in the research is the idea that loneliness is both genetic and environmental. And it's like having a thermostat. So the thermostat, what we're actually measuring to is our human need for connection. And so we have these genes that are set up, and we could say, let's just use this as an example. It might not be the best one, but let's just use extrovert and introvert as those genetic markers, right? So if you're genetically an extrovert, you get a lot of energy from being around other people. So guess what? That means you have a need to be around other people. Otherwise, you're going to start getting that feeling of, oh man, I'm isolated. Where are the people that I can go talk to?
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're on the other end of the spectrum and you're an introvert, your need for human interaction may not be as high as the extrovert. And so you are like, yeah, it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like 2020 happened and you're like, oh, it's been amazing. Yes.
Yep.
But then you also have to start, and I think this is like a boundaries thing too. So you have that internal, and then you have the external. And the external says, okay, I know this about myself. Is my external environment meeting that need?
Mm-hmm.
Because when I think of my personal definition of loneliness, it's our human capacity for connection. And it's just like being thirsty and being hungry, only the fact is you're looking for some form of connection. And so when you're hungry and thirsty, what does that mean? It means you have an unmet need.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're lonely, you have an unmet need. So how do you start to satisfy and meet that need is the big question that I think all my work is around trying to help people meet that need and realize that most of it comes from inside you and a lot less than you think has anything to do with anybody else.
So hearing you talk about like how loneliness and that need for connection is just like hunger and thirst, it made me think about how, as an extreme extrovert, I could tend to look for the fastest, quickest way to connect with someone that might not leave me feeling as fulfilled, and it might still leave me kind of feeling lonely. And I think that that's when we need to like look at the quality of the relationships that we are allowing ourselves to be surrounded by or having in our lives. We're looking at those connections then. And it's like, do I choose like junk food to meet this need because maybe it'll give me like a quick fix of connection? But maybe I need to be looking more for like something that's soul nourishing when it comes to connection, someone who can be having this level of intimacy that I'm looking for. And I think we settle for less than what we're looking for or wanting when we have a high level of codependence in our lives.
Oh man, yeah, I'm in 100% agreement there because I think goes back and when I had a speaking engagement, I talked about this, and it's the idea that like we're settling because our whole life has been based on this continuum of checking things off, and these things equal a good life, a meaningful life. And yet, as we're doing it, we're not actually for the most part, paying attention, or just like, I check this off, now on to this, and we don't actually sit with, well, wait a minute, why do I believe that? Is that actually true for me? And here's an example that I think about in my own life. So, the American dream. You're born, you go to school, you graduate, you then go to college, you get a job, you get a house, get a family, blah, 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 blah. And the whole thought about getting a house, like, as I actually thought about that, because there was a time when I would have just been like, yes, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. But then I'm like, hey, Nathan, so if you have a house, it means you're responsible for all the repairs.
Yes.
You're responsible for cutting the grass, doing all that stuff. So do you want to have it just to look good and to be meeting a status? And this applies to relationships as well. So don't think
100%.
don't think that this is just about a house, okay?
Yep.
But do you want to have all that and take on that responsibility, when ultimately what I knew was, so I'm not going to be the person repairing anything. Even if I know how to repair it, I would much rather have somebody else do it. And it's difficult enough for me to try and cut the grass. And so it really challenged my belief in what the American dream is. And I think we have so many areas of life in which we as humans just do what we see, right? That's ultimately what happens. We like the Matrix, right? We're sitting in those little pods and we just follow along without asking any questions. And then we end up in a place and we're like, wait a minute, how did I get here?
Yeah.
Why am I here? And it's because we just blindly went along with what we thought we were supposed to do without asking any questions.
Yeah. And then it's like not only doing what we think we're supposed to do, but then staying because we think we're also supposed to stay. And then tolerating because we think that that's what we're supposed to do as well. That whole like tolerance word has come up now like many times, even just in the past few days in my life. And when I see patterns, I always know to raise an eyebrow and consider like what am I supposed to be, or not supposed to be, but what opportunity do I have to look at this in a different way? And I think for people who are dealing with codependency, sitting there in whatever space you're in, whether it's your relationship or your home or your career, you can kind of say like, what am I tolerating? Why am I tolerating this? And is it time to let go? Is it time to shift something here?
Yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful word, because when we're talking about boundaries, right, that's ultimately you're asking that question when you examine boundaries. What am I tolerating? And if it's something that I don't want, what needs to change? What boundary do I need to put in place? And if this boundary is crossed, what's the action that I have to take to rectify? Because I think the idea of staying or getting in the relationship, it happens. Like, I'm reading a great book about If You're in My Office, It's Already Too Late, written by a divorce lawyer. And ultimately, the number one thing he talks about, it can be broken down into communication. And we don't always do a great job of communicating things because we make up a whole story about where that communication is going to lead even before we necessarily communicate it. So we have this whole conversation in our head as we're practicing. Well, I need to have this conversation with Nathan, or I need to have this conversation with Michelle. Like, that was the funniest thing that I would see as we were doing the loneliness solution. A lot of times the thing would be like, am I doing this right? Like, and they would say, well, I didn't want to call you because I thought you were too busy. And that's the kind of stuff that happens. Everybody makes up a story. I was like, well, if I was too busy, guess what? I wouldn't have answered if you called, right? And we just stop ourselves from even taking the action in a lot of different areas.
So if someone was dealing with codependency, a message that you might hear them say is, oh, I didn't want to call and make you feel like you had to talk to me. That whole like make you feel. So there's this belief then that we're responsible for the way that someone else feels. Like, by calling someone, though, we're not responsible for how they feel about that phone call. We're not responsible for someone else's emotion. That's their emotion to have. We're responsible only for ours. We're not responsible for their actions. We're not responsible for their well-being, unless it's like you're a parent of a child, then you are responsible for their well-being. But as they're growing, that responsibility is shifting over to them. So, and also with codependency, we may see them say, oh, well, now I feel like somebody's calling me, I have to pick up. There's a lot of like doing things that we don't want to do, or saying yes when we actually want to say no, or it's like doing the opposite of what we really want to do, but feeling like we have to, or constantly feeling like we're being taken advantage of, but really it's that lack of boundary, right? Or feeling like there's more giving than receiving, like an unbalanced relationship there. So now that I'm learning more and more than I already knew about codependency, I'm really looking at things through that lens of, when is codependency showing up for people that I'm working with, for myself, for friends, family, and then how can that be shifted into a more healthy message of, I'm going to take the responsibility of making that phone call for myself, and it's up to them if they want to connect with me.
Yeah. Oh man. So that's so interesting about the phone call, because how many times it's like the phone's ringing, so I have to pick it up. Like, that's what the train of thought we've been trained to think, that because I'll get phone calls sometimes and be in the same room with my mom, and she'll be like, "You're not gonna pick it up?" And I'm like, "No, I don't actually feel like prepared to talk to this person at that moment." Or
Right.
we ultimately have a choice, but I think we forget that we have choice, and we just do things without thinking. And I think the interesting thing is, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about addiction, but I was thinking about it in a different way. I think we, more people than we even realize, and maybe to some degree, even us sitting here right now, our addiction could be access. we have so much access to people that we've become addicted to, like, oh, I'm going to be able to talk to them whenever, or like how, and we get addicted to
the quick fix.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things, is to like ask yourself, who am I giving access to for me? And do I want that person to have that access or not?
Yeah. It reminds me of that comparison that we talked about between the two of us, where you've got like a nice wall and you've got like VIP and everything. And I was in the past over here just like, no barriers. Anyone who wants to come can come on over. But then you find yourself in this space of tolerating things that maybe you need to let go, and being dependent on someone else to make you feel good is giving that away, and that really needs to be something that's looked at if anyone is thinking like, oh yeah, that's me, like that can be shifted. And the more we're able to take ownership for our own emotions and give other people the power back for their emotions too, that we're not responsible for them, it just feels a hell of a lot better. It does.
Yeah. And so I think like an actionable step there is, sometimes it's just saying, hey, it's okay to feel that way. Like actually verbalizing that to somebody, instead of automatically going into, well, let's make it better. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you need to feel what you're feeling. If you ultimately want it to be better, you need to be able to understand whatever that feeling is. I was
Mm-hmm.
talking to a friend about this the other day, and like I've been dealing with a lot of technical stuff and learning things for the first time, and it just got really frustrating. And I was talking with one of my coaches, and they were like, so okay, we know frustration is not one of the core emotions. How are you really feeling? And I was like, dude, I'm angry. Like, this whole situation is just making me angry because I'm doing all this work and I'm not getting the results. Like, I haven't been able to let go of the result. Like, I want to get this result. And that's proof that, yeah, I know that intellectually, but that's still
Right.
something that I get to work on too. Like, and it's much easier, as Michelle said earlier, it's much easier to support somebody else through something sometimes than it is to support yourself
Mm-hmm.
um, through that same exact thing. But what I was saying to my friend was, the great thing is now I can actually verbalize that, yeah, I'm angry.
Mm-hmm.
Because how many times do we actually feel something
Mm-hmm.
and we go back to what I call the four-letter words of disconnection, right? And we're like, oh yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah.
Or I'm good.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes along with a tone that tells another story. But we just get into that mode of answering really, really quickly without it actually being like, no, that's not really, I'm angry, or I'm sad, I'm disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're feeling like this conversation has been resonating, I think that's one thing that I would say would be a takeaway, is
Mm-hmm.
to get to a place where you can practice, even if it's, I like to do it twice a day when I'm actively involved in it, but taking something like a note card, or even like a label that's for a name tag, and writing down the emotions that you felt during the day, twice a day, to give it a physical place to be, and you can acknowledge what you've been feeling.
Absolutely. I actually have it right here. I've been using these. They're little like emotional trackers where you can write down the different feelings that you're feeling. You can color code them, and just get a track of how you're feeling, and allowing yourself to feel, because you got to feel it to heal it. And I think if you grew up in a space where maybe you were told messages of like, it's not okay to feel the way that you're feeling, it might be a tough assignment to start doing. So that's a really good action item. Another one that I would suggest is to find someone, or more than one person, that you can talk about some stuff with. And, I think a lot of times if we're in a relationship, we want that person to be our person for everything. They have to be our go-to for us to feel happy when we're celebrating. They're our go-to when things are bad. We're also talking like we're doing everything. They have to meet all of our needs. And that puts a lot of pressure and expectation on a relationship and on a marriage. And one person does not have to be your end all be all to everything. If you know that maybe your person is great when things are rough, but when you want to get excited and giddy about something, you need to go to like your mom, who's your number one fan, and she's the first person that you tell. Or maybe your person isn't great about talking through hard emotions. And that's when maybe turning to a coach, a therapist, your best friend, if you know that they can handle the hard stuff and sit there with you. But I think it's just important to recognize where to go with these emotions, whether it's maybe you do need to sit with them more yourself instead of running to someone else, or maybe you're on the other side where it would be good for you to crack open a little bit and let some people in. So only you know which is going to be best for you, and you can experiment to see what feels good and what feels the most supportive for you.
Yeah, that in alignment with like the connection buddies that I talk about, right? Finding that person, and I think you're 100%. There are going to be different people for different things. And another good example, right? Because we have such a bigger audience of people with disabilities. Like that's one thing. If you want to talk about disability related issues, chances are not a lot of people are going to necessarily understand that. So it's about finding somebody who you're like, oh yeah, you get it.
Right.
Like you get what I'm talking about. And it's not that you let me sit in it, you understand it and you help me get through it. And so find it's probably multiple people for different things. And it's not like you said, if you were expected to have all the answers for somebody else like that,
I'm going to disappoint you.
Yeah.
I'm going to, because you can't be everything to everyone, and that's okay.
100%. Well, and this has been a great conversation. Before we head out, I want to say, go ahead, if you found anything supportive in here, drop it in the comments so we know. And also, if you have things that like questions that come up, whether they're related to relationships, whether they're related to loneliness and connection, feel free to drop those questions in, because we have conversations all the time and we want to be a big support to you guys. Like I said, whether you're here on Facebook, whether you're listening over on the podcast or whether you're seeing this on YouTube, wherever you're seeing it, feel free to drop a line in there and we will jot them down for our next upcoming conversations. And make sure and give us a like and subscribe if you're not already. And with that, Michelle, where can people connect with you directly?
Yeah, you can find me on my website, www.drfynan.com. I'm also Dr. Fynan on Clubhouse and Instagram, and we're getting back active on Clubhouse, so I'd love to chat with you there as well.
And you guys can find me at the Loneliness Coach. I've got a community over there, ConnectedAF, where we talk all things connection. And also, if you know somebody who's experiencing loneliness, maybe it's you, maybe it's somebody you know, and you want to find deeper connection and deeper relationships in your life right now, the Loneliness Solution just opened up for the second time. So that enrollment is open, and you just let me know you want in, put Loneliness Solution somewhere, and I'll make sure and get you what you need. And with that, we'll see you during our next conversation.
Bye, everyone.